Washington is within reach. That's the message echoing from Moscow to the Caribbean. In the past few hours, a close ally of the Kremlin declared that nothing prevents Russia from sending the Oreshnik ballistic missile to Venezuela, just a few flight hours away from the American capital. The statement comes as the United States reinforces its military presence in the Caribbean, while Caracas turns to Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran for support against what it calls a direct threat. But what's really behind this message? Behind closed doors, analysts point out that Russia has already shipped new air defense systems to Venezuela, including the Pantsir S-1 and Buk M2E, both delivered aboard Il-76 cargo planes. These shipments upgrade Venezuela's shield, already changing the risk calculation for any potential air operation in the region. The Oreshnik, however, is something else entirely. It's a medium-range ballistic missile, hypersonic, and capable of carrying multiple warheads. It was battle-tested in November 2024 in Ukraine, the kind of weapon that is never mentioned publicly without triggering alarms in Washington. Politically, there's a crucial detail. Since the INF Treaty collapsed in 2019, the world lost the guardrail that limited land-based missiles of this range. The informal MTCR agreement still discourages proliferation, but it carries no legal force. In practice, nothing stops Moscow from acting, except the cost, the risk, and the nerve to cross the line. And that's where the tension builds. Are we witnessing a calculated bluff meant to pressure Washington, or the dress rehearsal for a new missile crisis, with Caracas playing the role once held by Havana? In the next chapters, we'll separate fact from propaganda and uncover what would truly change if this weapon ever crossed the Atlantic. The Oreshnik is a Russian intermediate-range ballistic missile designed to strike targets up to 5,100 kilometers away. It's an evolution of the older RS-26 Rubezh, now upgraded with hypersonic technology capable of flying at more than 12,000 kilometers per hour. Its first combat use came in November 2024, when Russia launched it against a factory in Dnipro, Ukraine. The impact was devastating, even without an explosive warhead. Sheer kinetic energy alone was enough to destroy the target, proving that the Oreshnik isn't just propaganda, it's a real, operational, and terrifyingly efficient weapon. Beyond its speed, the missile has another strategic advantage: mobility. It can be launched from heavy trucks, making it difficult to detect and almost impossible to neutralize before firing. And unlike older, liquid-fueled rockets, the Oreshnik uses solid fuel, allowing it to be launched within minutes rather than hours. But what really gets Washington's attention is geography. Deployed in Venezuela, a missile with this range would place Washington, D.C. and New York squarely within its strike radius in just a few minutes. Even worse, the Oreshnik can carry up to 6 independent warheads, meaning a single launch could hit multiple targets at once. Today, there's no treaty preventing Russia from transferring such a weapon. The former agreement that banned missiles of this range, the INF Treaty, was abandoned in 2019. Since then, both Moscow and Washington have been free to develop and test intermediate-range weapons again. An informal arrangement called the MTCR still discourages the sale of this technology, but it's not legally binding. In practical terms, that means Russia could send the Oreshnik to Venezuela if it wanted to. What's missing isn't permission, it's logistics and money. Moving a system of this size across the Atlantic would require a complex, expensive, and highly visible operation. That's why many analysts believe the threat serves a different purpose: psychological pressure. A reminder that Moscow can still bring its firepower closer to American soil, even while bogged down in Ukraine. In other words, the Oreshnik is both weapon and message. And if that message is ever taken seriously, it could reignite the same fear the world lived through in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis reborn. It all starts with a simple phrase, one that carries a very calculated message. Nothing prevents us from sending the Oreshnik to Venezuela. Those words came from Alexei Zhuravlyov, one of the most influential members of Russia's parliament and a familiar face on Moscow state television. When a politician that close to the Kremlin speaks, it's rarely by accident. In Russia, statements like this are often read as the indirect voice of Vladimir Putin himself. Zhuravlyov's interview came right after the United States increased its military presence in the Caribbean, a move the Kremlin views as a direct provocation. At the same time, Nicolas Maduro's government faces growing diplomatic isolation and is turning toward Russia, China, and Iran, the three powers openly challenging U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. In recent months, Venezuela has already received new Russian air defense systems, including the Panzer S-1 and the Buk-Nu-E, both delivered aboard Il-76 cargo planes. These systems can intercept fighters, drones, and cruise missiles, a major upgrade to Caracas's defensive shield. Those deliveries are real, confirmed by flight logs and satellite imagery, but the Oreshnik would be an entirely different story. Deploying a missile of that class would turn Venezuela into a direct threat point to U.S. territory, something not seen since the Cold War. And that's exactly the game Putin is playing. By mentioning Venezuela, he doesn't need to promise a missile delivery. He just needs to plant the doubt. That single phrase forces the U.S. to consider the possibility, revise contingency plans, and redeploy forces. It's a classic act of geopolitical pressure, where uncertainty itself becomes a weapon. For Maduro, the dynamic is equally useful. By aligning himself with Russia, he projects strength at home and gains leverage abroad. Simply being part of the conversation alongside Moscow changes his position on the global stage. Meanwhile, the Kremlin gains something priceless, a new pressure point right in America's backyard. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. Because even if no missile is ever shipped, the strategic effect has already taken hold. The United States now has to respond to a threat that might not even exist. If Russia were ever to send the Oreshnik to Venezuela, the military balance of the Americas would change overnight. Washington would suddenly face Russian missiles capable of striking U.S. territory, positioned barely 2,000 kilometers from Florida. That distance turns any diplomatic dispute into an immediate national security crisis. Inside the Pentagon, such a scenario is treated as an absolute red line. It doesn't matter whether there are 5 missiles or 50. The mere presence of a system like the Oreshnik in the Caribbean would be seen as an existential threat, and the response would come fast. The United States could order a total naval blockade of Venezuela to stop Russian cargo planes and ships from arriving. That would be the first step. The second would likely be a preemptive strike to destroy any suspected launch sites before the missiles became operational. All of it justified under the same argument Kennedy used in 1962, self-defense against a direct threat. But there's one crucial difference between 1962 and 2025. Back then, the Soviet Union had the resources and logistics to sustain a global confrontation. Today's Russia is bogged down in the war in Ukraine, its economy under pressure, its military industry stretched thin. Sending strategic weapons halfway across the world would be risky, expensive, and possibly pointless. Still, Putin understands the power of the threat itself. He knows he doesn't need to launch missiles to create fear. He only needs to suggest he might. Every headline, every Western reaction serves as a reminder that Russia can still move pieces on the global chessboard. It's a strategy of psychological attrition. While the U.S. divides its focus between supporting Ukraine, containing China, and watching the Middle East, the Kremlin adds one more flashpoint, this time in the heart of the Americas. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. Because it's not just about weapons. It's about national pride, the image of power, and the struggle for influence. These invisible factors, the ones no radar can detect, are often the ones that ignite great wars. In the end, this story isn't really about Venezuela. It's not even about the Oreshnik missile. It's about how fear remains the most powerful weapon in the world. Putin knows that better than anyone. He understands that by merely suggesting the idea of placing missiles in America's backyard, he doesn't actually have to do it. All he has to do is say it, and the world moves. Washington revises its plans, calls emergency meetings, reshuffles alliances, all because of one carefully chosen phrase. But that's how every escalation begins, with words that turn into gestures, gestures that turn into actions, and actions that no one can control anymore. Today's images may resemble 1962, but the world is no longer the same. It's more fragmented. Diplomacy is weaker, and the red lines are closer than ever. One miscalculation, one misread interception, or a single reckless speech, and the Caribbean could once again become the most dangerous place on Earth. The question is simple and unsettling. Are we witnessing a calculated bluff? Or the rehearsal for a new missile crisis? The world is watching, and when the first move is made, it will be too late to guess who was only bluffing. Subscribe now to the Global Defense Report, because understanding what's really behind these threats might be the difference between information and manipulation.